Welcome to this introductory talk, in which we're going to explain to you today about the State of Disappearance project. I'm delighted I'm going to be joined by the abstract Mexican artist Chantal Meza, in which we're going to engage with the questions around the politics and art concerning human disappearance, why the problem is a problem in the context of the contemporary world, and what art and politics can allow us to do in order to make sense of this problem. But before we go into some of the more finer details around this, I'd like to have engaged with a conversation with Chantal about the history of the project, because I came to the project through her work, and why, for she as an artist, this became a particular problem. So, hi Chantal.
Hi.
So can you tell me about the history of the project, why this became such an important issue in your life, and what it meant to you as an artist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in 2017, I went to Chiapas, Mexico. I went to visit the Zapatistas communities and other groups. And I was in search for something which I didn't knew really what it was. But I knew that in that moment, for me, my work wasn't... It wasn't enough, just the ability to be able to, work these paintings that I was doing. I needed something else, and in traveling there, I found what this problem of human disappearance was doing in my, shaping my country really. That even now, so I started to engage there with this problem, and I found it very disruptive, because I didn't knew if I was going to be capable of create something that will talk to that problem. I didn't know whether, especially abstraction, I guess, can deal with such a horrific subject. So I think I was surprised, and I'm surprised now, that actually is through abstraction that I have found how art is so important in dealing with political problems and social problems, really. I think it's so important.
What does abstraction mean to you?
Well, I think all of us think, or most of us think, that, the world is something that you only see if you see it, if you touch it, it's real. And if you sense it, it's just subjective. If you sense it, then it just exists on some kind of, your imagination, really. But I think what we don't realize is that abstraction, or that which is related to the sensational, as that we are, as humans are part of. We are senses, and not only, let's say, the brain. I think if we realize that that's a huge part of our lives, then I think we will probably perceive and take decisions very differently. Because in that abstraction, I think, is where we, to me, shapes most of our actions. So the abstract plays very close from, works very close from with the emotions. And just because of that, I think with the senses, not only emotions, but the senses. And that's why it's so so important. How do I use abstraction in art? And abstraction is in many arts, in all the arts. But in paint, the abstraction is just pure shape, pure ink, pure pigment, pure color. So in a way that purity, then the link with what abstraction is in paint is very important to be able to capture then something so important as the senses in life, I think. Yeah.
No, I get what you mean, because there seems to be this sense in which, in order for something to be true and real, it has to be material and it's certain, right? And I think in terms of, if you think about it in terms of philosophically or politically, we have this idea that something is visible, therefore it's true, therefore it's factual, therefore it's right. And I think there's a rich history of critical thinking where we say, well, actually, we have to think through the senses. And on the one hand, we can talk about then grand ideas of metaphysics are abstract, but they're no less real. They guide our lives in terms of how we think of what is good, what is right, what is just, and so forth. And also the intimate depths of suffering or the intimate depths of joy, which also are not so material, but they are very real to our lives. So, of course, then painting and the way you paint would respond to these problems, because the world is more real in its abstraction than what it is in a simple, concrete, visible form. Is that what you understand by the power of the art?
Yeah, because, I think that's why it was, it seemed very difficult, but then it get very easy to pass all of this problem I was dealing with through the abstraction, because that's where I think, to me, the importance as well of the art of abstract art as a form of being there already. It exists there in our actions, in our very like you call them material, in a material world, in the materiality of our bodies, or even the materiality of the things I used to create. I don't know if I'm explaining well, but that's where, to me, the abstraction is never absent. So the abstraction is there. It is just how do we pay attention to it, really. I guess it's like the raw material in a way. It is the raw sense of life.
Well, I think that because this is really important, right? Because if we're talking about, I think that line you say is brilliant, because this idea that abstraction is never absent, because this comes onto the question about why, for me as a philosopher, I'm interested in the art that you do, right? Because part of the fundamental problem when we're concerning human disappearance is precisely what is absent, what is removed from our understanding, what is removed, literally and physically eviscerated, annihilated from the world. Now, the question of disappearance, to me, exposes all the limits of our ethical, political, intellectual coordinates, right? So how do we philosophically come to terms with absence? How do we aesthetically come to terms with absence? Or indeed, how do we return something back in the presence of the absence? How do you do justice to that absence? And I think that's where, to me, then, the power of art is so important, in terms of bringing something back in through the violence which has forced a fundamental absence in our understanding. And that, to me, is where the art becomes important as a political form of intervention. Maybe I can ask you in return, for me, it becomes, art is important because art allows us to deal precisely with the crisis that absence produces. The crisis in thought, the crisis in truth, the crisis in understanding, the crisis in justice. What do you think then the political offers in return, in terms of, why for you as an artist is it important to engage collaboratively with somebody like myself who deals with politics?
Yeah, well, it's very similar, right? Because it was also when we were talking then in 2017 about this project, and more about the project, we were just talking about what was happening really. And in those moments, I think what happened was really it was just this conversation of what you were bringing me, through your work. I was expressing some concerns, and through your work, you were able to kind of fill those gaps that are in my head, even, helping me through it to understand. So again, it just becomes very easy, really. So it doesn't feel apart. It doesn't, your work and the politics and it doesn't feel apart from what I was doing. Actually, it felt like it needed that conversation.
Because I think we're grappling with the same problems, though, right?
Yeah.
Because I think grappling with the same problems in the sense of we're both trying to come to terms with, the annihilation of life, right? And how do we recognize, whether you come at it philosophically, you recognize you're coming up against a limit which has seemingly no answers. If you're coming up against politically, you say, well, okay, how do I deal with a problem which doesn't no longer appear as a problem because life is no longer there? You can't have politics without life. What happens if you remove a life? In terms of justice, how do you come at a problem where you're seeking justice and retribution, but there's no crime in the sense of there's no evidence of the crime. There's no, and in the context of art, you can say, well, okay, what does it mean to deal with this philosophically? And I know you've talked about this to me before, about part of your frustration was in the way in which responses to disappearance were very familiar in terms of just the representation of faces. Maybe you can tell me a bit more about that in terms of that frustration.
Yeah, that was the first frustration I encountered, really, because, of course, that we know with forced disappearance, what happens is that the families immediately, well, what you want to find, something has disappeared, what is it? Is a person. So, all right, we can help you to find this person. How does it look? And so you have a face. So lots of families, then you see these faces all the time. Now I say all the time, I mean, I remember that when I was a child, this was in my kind of like in my imagination and my memory already. That as a child, I remember looking at images, even on television or on the streets on papers, that, if you find this person it has disappeared. And they were like children, they were young people, they were adults, they were women, they were men, So, of course, that when I was a child, I couldn't think, I couldn't think on it, really. I knew that it was there. So later, then years later, I encountered this problem, and to me, it just comes all these faces. I said, all right, I remember looking at all these faces. And then that's where I think for me, it was more about how can, through abstraction, these people need this person. It's so specific. They need this person. And what can you do with that? Because how could you help them find them? Because that's all they care, really. But in that, it seems so simple that someone just, not simple, but, it seemed that someone just disappears and the only thing you care about is to find it. But there is so much in it. There is so many things and problems around it that it just becomes massive. It just becomes this giant problem. So for me was, okay, first of all is the image of the person you care, the person that disappeared. And I guess the apparitions series, drawings, was to me that kind of lots of faces, images that were there. There is in the collective memory that if I don't have anybody who is being disappeared, how do I receive it? How the society receives this? So I think for me, the apparitions then is this another image, somebody else disappeared. But also all these faces, people of families, because it's one person who disappeared, but that one person has 50 members of family, friends. So all those, kind of all this group of people then are there as well, but not there because you don't know them. So there is that, and then there is all this, I guess, kind of ghost images of what faces, I think, bodies, because it's very material, like you were describing it. So I don't know, how do you engage with this, for example, for you, because I know that for me it's still very there for me, abstract in the problem of how to represent even some things, it's all of this. But when you see how do you see it from your perspective, when you see an abstract image, especially, I know you asked me what do I think about abstraction, but for you, with this first drawings of apparitions, I remember your first thoughts were, I see lots of bodies there, I see lots of images, even in the simple thing of paper and ink. And I remember first conversations, how did you took that?
So I think there's this question around the art as a disruption, and also the way in which you talk about how do you see the problem. And I think the sense, for instance, in the UK, we have this engagement with disappearance, which is nowhere near on the kind of level that you have in your country. But that doesn't mean to say, of course, disappearance doesn't take different forms. But in the context, for instance, of the UK, there's been a very few select high-profile cases of disappearance of children, for instance. And the images of those faces are embedded in the national consciousness as much as anything else, right? So you have the familiarity of the image, and also it becomes very kind of vocal and public in terms of the recognition of the trauma suffered by the families who have to live with that disappearance, as you say, just wanting to find their children or just wanting to find their loved ones. Now, there have, of course, been more broader examples where there used to be a case, I think it was in the 1980s and early 1990s, where you would have just the image of missing persons on cartons of milk, for instance. And now, in that sense, I recognize on the one hand, as you say, the representation, first of all, of the image in the face is all about trying to bring something of the human back into just a person's disappeared. So you see the face and hopefully you resonate with it. But that comes up against a limit once it's not just 5 children or 10 children, when it's 250,000 people, right? And I think what really struck me then about the work that you were doing with the apparitions was precisely the disruption I felt, because I realized that it was, as you say, so many bodies, so many lives, so many different people who are simply not only missing or disappeared or killed without any trace, but all the tens and hundreds of thousands of people who know somebody who's disappeared, have an intimate connection with the families of the disappeared. And I think that then becomes, if we want to look at that broader organization of disappearance, the organization of people who are so emotionally invested, such that you cannot simply reduce it to a photograph on a carton of milk or whatever. And even if you do, it becomes so repetitive, it loses something of its attempted resonance to bring humans back into the conversation. So I think your apparitions series then, I think it precisely does that in terms of, how do we come to terms with all these ghosts of history? All these ghosts of history who have no justice, no resolution, no conclusion to the problem. And I think for me, then that's the real disruption of how do we make sense of the real magnitude of this violence. And I think that's the real problem that art can force us to confront maybe in a way which just simple physical representations of faces can't do.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's precisely what it was as well. Like I did found that, of course, that you need a face to find it, but then how do you represent all that, all of the, because all of them I also mentioned, like, well, it's not only mind. What they get surprised by it is that once they encounter that, is just thousands of people missing. So it's just all of that put together. Now, when doing that, the next thing I encountered was there were like pieces of things, pieces of memories, pieces of facts, pieces of hearts, pieces of souls, pieces of lots of pain, where it seemed that they were just all over the place. And to me, that was a need. I needed to, I deal with the face, which is the black and white face. Normally I don't know why they present as well the black and white face. They tried to do that with the apparitions, but then it came with the fragments, where the fragments of a catastrophe, where that's, like I'm saying, all those kind of pieces of things that you could see the families are, when you see in their eyes, there is also a, like, if they were thinking a million things. So but also when they talk to you, well, when they express what is going on, you see how that kind of like they live a fragmented life. So and sometimes it's good, sometimes, like many have expressed as well, sometimes I feel bad if I laugh, because I shouldn't be laughing. Sometimes I feel bad if I eat, because what if my husband, what if my child, what if my girl, what if my boy is not eating? So it's like they leave fragments of things, and then their lives are never the same. So it's like whatever they have left, then it becomes just a piece of broken things. So I think, yeah.
Well, I think one of the real terrors of disappearance is the violence it does to time. Right? So it shatters time, and it's like as if everything, as you say, is like a broken mirror, right? So and the sense of time, and this, you've talked about this a lot, and in the testimonies of people who live with disappearance, they do talk about the way in which every day seems the same, but it just collapses. Their memories are all kind of broken into one, and they have no sense of. But also the simplest item can mean so much to them. An old school trophy or a shoe, or and I think that understanding of the fragmentary is so important, and the fragments which become so precious to them. The fragments which might just be a clue to where they've gone to, the fragment of, and...
That's also something, sorry to interrupt you, but that's also part of, one of the things exactly that most of these stories, it's so horrible stories where they say, it's unbelievable how much then, when you realize somebody has disappeared, how much you have to remember. For example, I remember reading once a girl saying, make sure that you remember the last time you see somebody, what were they wearing? What were they using? Where were they going? So it is all those little pieces that is like the what's this word? The kind of like forensic of the thing, right? Of what a person is. So all those little fragments that you're describing as well, how important they become, but how much pain they hold on to. Because, objects are always something that we carry on. that in a way we think that's the person, but it's actually when you have the object, it's all this kind of fragmented memories of what you have of this person in an object.
Well, I think also, so what I'm interested in, and particularly with the Fragments series, is, so Walter Benjamin has this great theory that history is fragmented, right? And we put together the parts of history which we like to preserve. We'd like to forget other parts. So history is not linear, it's just a fragmentary history. And we do that with our lives. We kind of curate the things in our lives we want to remember, and we can access the archive of the mind in a very fragmentary way, actually. But the other thing, and I think your Fragment series really does that brilliantly, again, because all the separate pieces and you can move them around, and as you say, like in that kind of forensic way, but also the way in which the pieces talk to ecology, because the pieces have a real clear ecological dimension to them in terms of maybe an ecology of suffering. Can you perhaps explain a bit more about your impetus, about why the ecological appears so much in those kind of fragments of suffering that you present?
Well, I think because it's just it's the spatial, the spatial, in our mind we live in this space, but it's also into our memories. We locate something into a space. So also when you say, well, somebody disappeared somewhere, and you think, where is that space? What is disappeared? What has disappeared? What is it? Is it a person? Is it a memory? Is it a smell? Is it, so everything is linked to a space as well. So how do we perceive that a space? So we enter now to a park. We enter now to a, a mall or whatever other place where we used to be with that person, or we have a memory with this person. And this then has an impact that you don't see the world the same way. And the same with all the other things, all the problems, that you just, the space just becomes something different because of the memories you have around them.
But I think then for me, this idea then of, because what you seem to be suggesting, and I think what art can give, is points us to an ecology of the mind, right? So when we're dealing with the lived reality of disappearance, we have to deal with the aesthetic memory of living with such terror, with such torment, in which the distinction between the real and the unreal, the truth and the untruth, becomes so confused that you are effectively living within an ecology of terror. Right? And I want to bring this on to another one of your series which is The Void. Now, to me, when I guess the moment that I realized that the project itself was really doing something profoundly original in your work was when you were starting to really go with the series of The Void. Now, The Void has been historically something which has been dealt with philosophically, but not really, right? Because there's always this idea, I know a number of artists and philosophers historically have touched upon the void and tried to deal with the void. But it takes a great deal to try to say, okay, let's really confront the terror of the void, the terror of complete absence. How do we really come to terms with this? And I think this still seems to be a question where society does not want to go. We do not really want to confront the intolerability of the possibility of complete annihilation, complete nihilism, complete absence, or indeed see it in a more creative way. So what does that Void series mean to you? And what does it mean for you as an artist in terms of actually painting such horrific ecologies of terror in that way?
Well, The Void was a bit more personal, I would say. I know the whole thing, of course, is personal, but really touched by it, really. I don't think you can just go to the void, right? Like, just want to be there. You don't want to be there. You don't want to be there because it's just, it just feels, like you can't point it out, right? Like you are in a space where it is, just no escape, no. It feels like there is no escape, but there is no entrance. But you are there, but you are out. But you want to, it's just horrible space really to be mentally, and you can see again on the eyes of this on the people who has somebody who's disappeared or encounters something similar to it. There is a emptiness, there is a hole, there is a terror as well, there is a, I don't know, but so that's, I think precisely
But
that's the thing with the void.
I don't know is the word, right?
Exactly.
That is the I don't know.
Exactly.
And I think that is what the void is. It's the I don't know. And I think that is what can be so terrifying.
It is, yeah.
It's the absence of the knowledge of anything. And I think, other than the fact that you have the old fragments, right? And I think that's where it becomes terrible. But then in that sense, you have that terror, but then it's not like there's no agency, right? Because somebody is doing the disappearing, right? These are actual lives which are taken. These are, this is brutal. It's the most brutal form of violence, to simply eviscerate a life, to remove a life without any trace, so that people can't even mourn the death of someone. There's almost like a double violence which takes place. There's a violence to the body, but a violence to memory. So the violence carries over into the future without any resolution. So then come into the Obscure Beasts series, which comes out of the void. What you really do with that then is try to say, well, okay, let's deal with the real brutalism of this. And the brutalism of the violence, but a violence in which we are forced to question, who is the perpetrator of this violence? Who is the victim? Where is the beast? Who is the beast in this situation? And maybe you can reflect a bit more to me on that, what your thinking is on the obscurity of the beast and what you were trying to maybe convey with that series, which comes through the void into this, well, somebody is still responsible.
Yeah, I guess because of the space you are in, or you are put in, you are drawn to it, which is the void. Of course, that in that, I don't know, you're looking, searching, even something, right? And in that space, then is where to go. So I think for me, the obscure beasts come like a bit like of a splash into a white space now. So you come with the void, which is an obscure space, a dark space, and then you come into this white surface. That for some reason you just need that white surface to jump out it, to splash on it. And what this is splash, of course, that is a black mass. Now, I think you come out of it, or you come with it in it with this idea of, who did this to me, or why is this happening to me, or and then you start to do this, who is the perpetrator of it. But then in that kind of talk, in that game, I will describe it as a game. In that game, then there is the other person who will be saying, well, actually, if somebody disappeared, is because they are guilty of something. Mm-hmm. So they make them guilty,
So they become the beast instead of...
Exactly, those are the beasts, they disappear for this and that. Mm-hmm. And then the other people say, no, but you are doing this to me. You are not, Anyway, so it's just a game between them. Who is the beast really here? So I think in those forms is where they tried to kind of do this kind of dance, if you wish, or this battle as well. That's why there is so much splashed and signs of of a battle, of a blood, of, you know, all of that, because of it does feels like a battle for, you know, between them. I guess also I wanted to bring then the idea of how many, you know, because there are many stories where they are being burned. Lots of people who are who they have disappeared, then they burned their bodies. So when there's families come to I guess that's the relation with the blackness of it, the mass of it, of how a burned body looks like. And then when families have to confront him because they have to go and search for their own, you know, disappeared people because nobody's doing anything. So they go and walk, you know, places, and in the very, like in the dirt roads, they have to walk the mountains, and they have to search in very horrible places, and have to find traces of bones, traces of clothes, traces of these places where they burned people, a bit like the, you know, like don't know if I'm allowed to say this word, like the Nazis.
Like the Nazis.
Yes, a bit like the Nazis. So it's horrible, you know, to see this ovens even they have in the middle of the mountains, and, you know, you can see they burned bodies. Anyway, so the thing is that to me that was also important to bring that, I guess, to me, to imagine somebody, because there is also stories of people that have done that have burned other bodies, to come and say, I burned bodies, I did this, I did that. And you read those stories, and to me was, how do you feel as a human being having to do this to another one, having to be there, burning a body? How does it feel inside? How do you even think about burning somebody and having to be there, having to see the fire, smell, you know, because they even describe the smell of the bodies, you know. So to me, the obscure beast was this obscure place, this obscure person that has become an obscure human being. That there's this smoke happening, there's this obscure space in the earth, in the soil, having to bury somebody. Don't know. So I think the obscure piece is very, very horrible part. I don't know, how did you? I know I was creating these pieces when you know, you were there while I was creating these pieces, and you helped me then through as well. I think sometimes you just go too much into this that you need somebody else. I think to give a bit of a bit of talk through it. I think.
Well, I think what I realized when you were doing the Obscure Beast series, that was the series where you looked visibly the most traumatized. So after painting them, you know, I could see the literal kind of absence in your eyes, the kind of way in which the whole process seemed very exhausting emotionally for you. It was like as if you were kind of putting all that emotion onto the paper, in a way where by the end of it, you had gone to some place where, as you say, it was also inhabiting the obscure, inhabiting that kind of, you know, how do you make sense of that terror, that violence, that battle, that dance? And I think, you know, I know that for me, the pieces really kind of have that terrifying ballet to them. You know, what we might call against a reworkment of the dance macabre, right? There's a real macabre dance that's taking place in those pieces through the movement, through the violence. And as I say, that the blackness of the earth, of the, you know, the guttural depths of the depravity and the suffering, but also the explosion of blood there. And I think I was always kind of intrigued about, you know, it's like, well, why as an artist would you put yourself through that, right? In terms of, because I see for you going through it, it's not like you're just, willingly doing this because you think it's going to be a nice painting that would look nice on somebody's wall, but it's something you feel compelled to do. And it's something which I sense is deeply personal for you in terms of saying, I need to come to terms with this. And I know that you, when you deal with a problem, you invest so much time reading constantly about things, really trying to engage with the problem. And how does it feel for you as an artist when you were painting those pieces? Maybe you can't explain it, I don't know. But, to put yourself through that to the point where, you are crying at the end of it, or you're dealing with all that emotion, I'm not saying it's a therapy because, we've talked at length about art, it's not just therapy, right? But how does it feel for you as an artist? What does, to put yourself through that process?
Well, I think that's when I was, I think part of it as well has to do with the fact that I paint because that's what I do. I just do. That's what I do. And that I have that's what I am. That's what I do. But why do I do it? Because of, obviously I'm affected by it. I see things and I can't not react. Is that well said? Mm-hmm. I cannot react. Now, I think for me in that moment as well was important that you believed so much in art in a way where you saw art as the, part of the, we need art so much in our societies. Mm-hmm. Humans need it. That sometimes when you are doing it just because that's what you are, that's how you exist, you don't know something else, then when I guess there is in my case there was you expressing and kind of bringing me back to think, well, this is important because of because our societies do need this to confront it, maybe in a different way. So I think in there, it was more about, you bringing that belief, if you wish, to believe that actually what was happening there, it wasn't just a personal thing. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just me. Because in a way, even if I have that, ability of being able to get into others people's, emotions or suffering, still there is, and create something out of it. There is still this, thing where, all right, but how do you, like you say, come out of it? To just be a link, to just mm-hmm. be a medium in between these people who's just passing through this horror and this other people who doesn't have any idea, no clue of what is going on. Mm-hmm. And I think, I think it's important for that to say that the artist could be that kind of medium as well. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, the art is the medium, and I think the art is the medium to reaffirm to us that without art, we're not human. Because art allows us to touch into the senses, which make us human, too human, as Nietzsche might say, right? That Nietzsche has this point about, we need art so that we don't suffer from and die from the truth, right? And I think there's something really important in that idea that, that art is what makes us human. Without that, we are just automated machines. And I think without that understanding, then we lose sight of all the tragedy of existence, and we need to really retain that. But we can bring that then onto this, the other work that you've done, which perhaps in the title suggests the most personal of all, which is the collapse of consciousness. Because we're faced with this situation that we talk about with, this real raw reality of violence which leave us with ghosts, and then we go through this where it creates just a fragmentary history which takes us into this terrifying void. through this we understand then there is this kind of real dance of violence and a brutal obscurity to the violence. And you talk about, the way in which that presses down on you and how you go through that as an artist. But then you arrive at a piece called The Collapse of Consciousness. So it's not like you're saying, hey, I've resolved this. I've solved this. Art can help us now fix this problem in a very clear way. There's a guidance that we can go through. Art, of course, will now make it more visceral and visceral reality for us. But then for you then say, well, this is just leading to a collapse of consciousness too. So what do you think the collapse of consciousness was doing for you in that way? Do we need that collapse of consciousness in order for us to maybe rethink what's going on with this problem?
Well, I think we do, actually. I think you have, in many, in your work and our conversations, we constantly kind of face this part, right? Where it's like societies have passed through lots of horrible things, and sometimes it feels like that collapse comes to, I don't know, it feels like it's just too much. It has happened too much. And that collapse is not that it's an end. I never felt it like it was an end. Like I needed it to end, though you wish it all the time since the beginning, really. Mm-hmm. So you wish it to end. But at that moment after you have to pass through all of that, the collapse of consciousness doesn't mean that it's ending, that you will find a liberation, that you will find a way out, but actually that you just recognize that it's just there and it's not going to go. It's just, you pass through it. It shouldn't disappear. It shouldn't go away for you to forget and move on, like we normally like to do as a society. But actually yes, it's a collapse because, I don't know, probably nature is like that. So it's a collapse. But then it's a keep going at
it. Well, the
it.
collapse is a reminder then, no? Because I think what you're saying is
exactly.
the worst thing you can do is you have this disappearance and you just tell the families, okay, just move on, right? Because that in itself is a form of disappearance.
Yes.
So it's
you want
just want to forget about it. Let's put it to the back. Let's put it to history. And let's kind of not dwell on it too much. But actually, if you say, well, actually, this is leading to this is so overburdening. It's collapsing memory, collapsing consciousness. Then perhaps that's precisely where art becomes, in its most visible way, important in the sense of as a reminder. This has collapsed and it's bound to collapse under the weight of this moral, ethical burden. And we should remember that, not simply wish to forget.
Yeah, because the consciousness, being conscious, what does it mean to be conscious? You can't, if you are conscious, then you know. So then if you forget, then you have no consciousness. So if you wish to forget, if you wish to, I think part of it as well, it has to do with the fact I have heard many of them saying, well, for example, somebody disappeared and now I found him, found pieces of them or something, but in this finding of this person, I have encountered so many others that are in that same path. And you can't just forget. Even if you found somebody, even if you found the people who you were looking for, the person you were looking for, you can't forget the rest. And that, I think the collapse of consciousness is also a bit of a play with words, because, what I just explained. So the consciousness is to be conscious means to know, to remember.
Well, I guess we can bring that onto the final piece of this. Well, obviously it's not in any chronological order, but the final piece that we can talk about years since the beginning, because we can end. It seems strange to end on a conversation on since the beginning, but I guess the idea when we look back historically is, okay, well, first of all, when does enforced disappearance take place? Now, you talked earlier about the Nazi project, but Nazism didn't invent enforced disappearance. We could actually go back to the Atlantic slave trade, or indeed back even much further. The history of disappearance is a much broader genealogy to it, and how that kind of the collapse of consciousness also forces us to, with the since the beginning pieces, reassess the maps of memory, the maps of time, the maps of history, which really kind of offer an entirely different reading of the history of the human condition. Can you tell me more about that since the beginning piece, and how that kind of almost you end at a beginning, and what that kind of means in that sense?
Yeah, well, exactly. So, because since the beginning, then strangely was the last piece, but it felt like you wanted to, with all of this, you wanted to then say, well, I want to start, or also I want to know where it started. So I think since the beginning is a bit of how this all happened, who got this horrible idea that it was good to disappear people. What, where? And so it was a bit of a track, right? Or where did it started for me? Since the beginning, my story begins with this. But then it's not the beginning, is it? Because it is a beginning for somebody, but then somebody else comes, and then, so you got all this kind of strange map of, you don't know where it began. But then you want to begin, forget or not forget, but just put aside something and said, let's begin. But you can't, because you end up kind of in the same map. The world is the world. It's not going to...
Well, it reminds me of like Nietzsche's point on the eternal return, but I think there's the real important thing, I think what you're talking about there is, it's not just about who disappears or where disappearance is, but when, right? The when of disappearance. When is disappearance happening? When historically has it happened? So in that sense, disappearance is not just about bodies. It's not just about space. It is all about time. And I think that's where, again, the abstract becomes so important. Because to me, the genre of abstract painting poses better than any other form of painting the question of time. Figurative art is consecrated in time, a moment in time, a moment in history, like a snapshot, like a photograph. The thing about the abstract is it works in accordance to the logic of time, because time is not linear. We know this. So the question of the abstract then, to ask the question not what is disappearance or who is disappeared, but when is disappearance, demands an abstract response, because time itself, in its brutal tragedies and also in its joys and its affirmations, precisely works to a non-linear abstract conception of time, which is fragmentary. And I think that's where the work really resonates in that way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So, well, I think just one final point in terms of, so part of the project we've been working on has been to engage with much, wider conversations. And I think we talked a lot about when developing the project, and it was very much, I think, inspired by your idea that we should open up the project. And I think I know that, in the early stages, you were speaking with a lot of people who were involved with disappearance, and that need to have a public conversation. And the public conversation is so important to the families of the disappeared, to keep the memory alive of the lost people. And what we obviously decided to do was to open up the conversation to a much broader body of intellectuals, writers, academics, who are all coming at the problem from very different disciplinary perspectives, whether it's sociology, philosophy, history. What does it mean for you as an artist to engage with then different people from all those different intellectual backgrounds, and what do you hope can be achieved through those conversations?
Yeah, I think for me it's very important, of course, because of you realize then when you are producing this and in a way it's just yourself or is with somebody else with you, you know, to me it was so important then to have somebody else as well to go through that journey. So, you know, you imagine that same thing happening with lots of other people who have said, like you said just now, well, it's so important for the families for this to be known, for this to be part of another voice, an echo that goes into this, you know, problem that is so necessary then to add a voice to it. So I think I realized then that it was important to bring other people to talk about it, to see how they will engage with this idea of disappearance. So what is a state of disappearance? Sorry, what is a state of disappearance? So I think, yeah, I mean, to me, it's very very important to know that that it doesn't end. That is just a constant conversation with other people that will, you know, extend and expand this problem of what is to disappear. What does that mean?
I think this is a good point maybe to end it with, in terms of, you know, because we haven't talked about it as yet, the idea of a state of disappearance. Right? And this is the title of the project, a state of disappearance.
Yeah.
Because I think what that really recognizes is that in order to disappear a life takes a great deal of organization.
Yeah.
People just don't disappear. It takes a lot of planning, a lot of organization, of power, of violence. It actually is very difficult to disappear a life. And the point we talk about in terms of the collaboration is, you know, often people disappear, even if it's a group of people, alone, in isolation. It reduces the body down to something which is singular, which is vulnerable then as a result of that singularity, where life can simply die alone in the most horrific, brutalizing way. So invariably the response has to be collaborative. So maybe just as a final comment from you, what does the word state of disappearance mean to you?
Well, I think it means all the pieces I did, and even more because even with all the pieces I did, which I couldn't put into words, but into paint, into abstraction, because that's what I do. That's what it means. The state of disappearance, to disappear, the state, you know, everything. That's what it means. All those pieces. I couldn't put it into words. I couldn't say to you, you know, and we've been talking about an hour already for it. So a state of disappearance is just what those pieces are and more, which, you know, you still, 2 years is it? 2 years, I think 2 years or a year and a half since I stopped this production, and I still read, I still heard, I still have to, you know, I still engage with it, and there's more and more. So it's like it doesn't end. But I could be talking about it. I could keep creating more pieces. So it's just, it doesn't disappear in a way. Yeah.
And that's the real terror of the state of disappearance. It doesn't disappear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.